The stars glittered like a tapestry across the vast expanse of space, their glow soft yet all-encompassing, reflecting the might of the human empire. The emperor stood before the grand window of his citadel, watching as the ships of his fleet glided past, their hulls reflecting the light of distant suns. His empire stretched across half the galaxy, its people thriving under his leadership, their lives governed by the iron will he had forged through decades of war, diplomacy, and conquest. It was an empire that, in his vision, could never fall. But this moment of peace, however fleeting, was interrupted by the low hum of his communication device. The emperor did not flinch. He'd expected the message. It was his closest advisor, General Cashin, an older, battle-hardened veteran of the Great War who had been at his side since the earliest days of his rise to power. His voice crackled through the transmission, urgent but controlled. "Your Excellency, there's been a breach in the capital. A plot to assassinate you." The words sent a chill through the emperor, but his demeanor did not shift. He was a man who had walked through battles, commanded fleets, and stood unshaken in the face of insurrection. Assassins were nothing new to him. His empire had enemies at every turn. Yet something about the timing unsettled him. The peace talks were imminent, a moment when the universe was watching, waiting for him to lay down his final decree for the future of humanity. "I'll take care of it," he replied calmly, signaling his personal guard to ready themselves. But just as he turned to leave, the lights in his command chamber flickered. A loud explosion rattled the citadel, followed by the deafening sound of alarms. His eyes narrowed. A subtle shift in his thoughts, a sense of danger he couldn't quite place, told him this was more than just a simple assassination attempt. This was something far more orchestrated, and it smelled like treachery. As he rushed through the corridors of the citadel, his mind raced. Cashin's voice had been clear, but something was wrong. If someone had truly orchestrated an assassination attempt, it meant the conspiracy was closer than he'd ever imagined. The emperor's enemies were not just within the political circles, nor were they merely rebels from distant systems. They were inside his very seat of power. In the shadows of the empire, something dark had been growing. The emperor reached the secure chamber where Cashin had instructed him to go, but when the doors opened, the room was empty. No general, no guards, just an eerie silence hanging in the air. He quickly keyed in the security override, but it was too late. The cameras were already offline. The entire chamber had been sabotaged. His mind went into overdrive as he tried to piece together the puzzle. He had expected this: assassins, treachery. But what he hadn't anticipated was the complete isolation that this attack would cause. Whoever had orchestrated this wanted him alone, vulnerable. Another explosion shook the citadel, louder this time, and the building groaned under the impact. The emperor's heart quickened. There were no more half measures. He had to act fast. He signaled his personal security detail to retreat to a hidden escape route, and then he moved swiftly toward the control center, where his most loyal officers should have been. But when he arrived, he found the doors locked tight, too tight. Panic set in as he realized he was cut off from the only safe route. Suddenly, the doors opened, but it was not his officers who greeted him. It was a group of cloaked figures, their faces obscured by masks. They were swift, silent, and deadly. The emperor didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he drew his sidearm and fired, taking down the first figure with a single shot. The others lunged at him, but he was faster. He moved with the precision and grace that had earned him the title of emperor, striking each figure with lethal accuracy. But as the last figure fell, the emperor was struck with a realization, a bitter truth. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a declaration. Someone within his empire, someone who had once sworn allegiance to him, had been orchestrating this attack. And it was only the beginning. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the knowing weight of the battle to come. The true war was just beginning. The enemies of the emperor had come out of the shadows, and their conspiracy ran deeper than he had ever feared. The Emperor didn't pause. He turned toward the shattered view of the galaxy, a cold resolve settling in his chest. He would not fall. Not today. Not ever. The city was in chaos. Sirens blared, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning debris. Outside the walls of the Emperor's citadel, an army of rebels, cloaked in the colors of various alien factions, surged toward the heart of the Empire. They had come for one reason: to end the reign of the Emperor. And yet, as the Emperor stood among the wreckage, contemplating the recent assassination attempt, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a mere rebellion. This was the beginning of something much darker. In the depths of the capital's underground halls, an intelligence officer, Lieutenant Kira, monitored the movements of the rebels. Her eyes flickered across multiple holoscreens, each one showing different corners of the city under siege. Her fingers danced across the controls, working furiously to track any signs of weakness in the enemy's assault. She knew something the rest of the Empire's leadership didn't. The rebellion was not a spontaneous outburst, but a meticulously planned campaign that had been months, perhaps even years, in the making. The rebels weren't here just to fight. They were here to expose the Emperor's greatest vulnerabilities. "Lieutenant," a voice crackled through her communicator. It was General Cashin, the Emperor's trusted ally, though the officer's tone betrayed no sense of calm. "The Emperor's been moved. The Citadel's security systems are compromised. We've lost contact with key units. We need to regroup immediately." Kira clenched her fists. The betrayal had been swift, and it left her with a bitter taste in her mouth. She trusted the Emperor's inner circle, Cashin, her mentors, her comrades, but now she saw the truth. The rebellion was not a simple uprising. This was a surgical strike aimed at the heart of the Empire. The shadowy figure behind this rebellion, a mysterious leader known only as the Shade, had proven elusive. Their name was whispered in dark corners of the galaxy, but no one had ever seen them, until now. The Shade's influence had spread like a virus through the galaxy, turning once loyal officers into traitors, bending the will of entire systems to their cause. And now they had moved beyond the borders of political power. Now they had infiltrated the very core of the Emperor's security. As Kira worked feverishly to stabilize the situation, another chilling report came in. The Shade had not only infiltrated the Emperor's own ranks, but had also aligned with an unprecedented alliance of alien factions. The rebellion was not limited to one species or one ideology. It was a coalition of the disenfranchised, the oppressed, and the vengeful. The Shade had united them under a single banner: the overthrow of humanity's reign. And yet, Kira thought, the Emperor was not someone to be underestimated. He had survived countless battles, overcome insurmountable odds, and defeated those who had thought to bring him down before. Kira's instincts told her that the Emperor would not go down quietly. The whispers of his survival were already circulating in the corridors of the capital. In the shadows of the city, far from the chaos of the streets, the Emperor's presence was beginning to take form. The Emperor had survived the assassination attempt, just barely, and was now operating from the fringes of his own empire. With his closest allies scattered and a galaxy teetering on the edge of war, he had gone underground. His every move was calculated, designed to draw out the rebels and expose the traitors within his own government. Yet there was a growing sense of unease within the Emperor's camp. Something was off. The Shade's forces were not acting like typical rebels. They were methodical, precise, and unrelenting. The Emperor knew that their ultimate goal was not just the collapse of his empire, but his personal destruction. The Shade wasn't just seeking power. They sought to obliterate everything the Emperor had built. Days passed, and whispers of the Emperor's return began to filter through the ranks of his remaining loyalists. It was said that he had retreated to a hidden base on the Outer Rim, a place where even the most advanced sensors could not find him. From there, he would gather his forces, train his mind, and strike back against the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. The Emperor was no stranger to adversity, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. The Emperor's first move came swiftly and decisively. He issued a command to his most trusted agents, ordering them to secure critical assets on the capital planet. In the dead of night, a small fleet of stealth ships launched, infiltrating enemy lines and eliminating key rebel leaders. But even as the Emperor's forces struck back, Kira knew that the real battle was not for control of the capital, it was for control of the truth. The Shade had already begun to sow seeds of doubt, turning the people against the Emperor with every act of resistance. In their minds, the Emperor was no longer a hero of the galaxy. He was a tyrant, a symbol of everything they despised. And as Kira and Cashin worked to stem the tide of the rebellion, the Emperor's actions would soon speak louder than any propaganda. The stakes had never been higher. The Emperor's vision for a united galaxy was now at the brink of collapse, and the only question that remained was whether his iron will could hold against the storm that was coming. The Emperor's return had been swift, but the Rebel Alliance had proven more resilient than anyone had expected. What had begun as an insurrection, easily brushed aside in the early days of his reign, had now evolved into a full-fledged war that threatened to tear the very fabric of his empire apart. As his forces regrouped and began pushing back the invaders, the Emperor knew there was more at play than just military might. The rebellion was not a mere challenge to his power. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy from within. On a remote command ship, cloaked in the shadow of a gas giant, the Emperor stood before a holotable. His hands rested on the cold surface, fingers drumming in thought. The map displayed before him was a mess of red and blue, rebel strongholds dotting his empire's heart, with loyalists scattered like broken pieces of a shattered puzzle. The loyalty of his forces had always been his greatest asset, but now, even that was in question. The whispers of betrayal had become too loud to ignore. It had started with the small things: intelligence reports arriving late, strategic supplies diverted to wrong locations. Suddenly, the picture began to form, a pattern of deliberate sabotage. He could feel it, a sickness in the heart of the Empire. The betrayal was not just from external enemies. Someone, or perhaps several, had turned on him from within his own inner circle. The Emperor had always known that absolute power was fragile, but never had he thought it would unravel so quickly. At that moment, General Cashin stepped into the room, his face grim and weary. Despite their previous successes in repelling rebel forces, Cashin had a haunted look in his eyes, one that betrayed the growing tension between them. "Your Excellency," Cashin began, his voice steadied, but carrying a note of unease. "We've received reports of a sabotage within our ranks. Several key military installations have been compromised. We suspect it's an inside job." The Emperor turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Cashin's. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, and the weight of his stare bore down on the general. Cashin had always been a loyal soldier, his name synonymous with honor. But the reports were undeniable. "How deep does this go, General?" the Emperor asked, his voice cold. "Who can we trust?" Cashin shifted uncomfortably, glancing down for a brief moment before meeting the Emperor's eyes again. "It's worse than we thought, Your Excellency. Our own commanders are involved. At least 2, possibly more. The sabotage appears coordinated. It's not just a handful of traitors. We're dealing with a systematic corruption within our military command." The Emperor's fists clenched, his breath coming in short bursts. Betrayal by outsiders he could understand, but betrayal by those he trusted most, it was a blow to his very soul. He had built the Empire with blood and sacrifice, and now it seemed that Empire itself was being hollowed out from within. "We must find the source of this treachery, and we must find it now," the Emperor said, his voice hardening. "Who are the suspects?" Cashin hesitated. "It's not clear yet, but there are rumors, whispers in the ranks. Some say Admiral Valen." The Emperor didn't let him finish. "Valen?" His voice was filled with disbelief. "He was my closest friend during the war. I trusted him with the heart of the fleet. He would never." Cashin's expression didn't change, but the weight of the moment hung between them. "I thought the same, Your Excellency. But there are reports of his ships being seen in rebel-controlled space. We can't ignore this." The Emperor's mind raced. Admiral Valen, a man who had stood at his side through every major battle, was now a traitor. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was mounting, and the Emperor knew that the truth could no longer be ignored. His eyes narrowed. He had no room for doubts, not anymore. "Prepare a strike force. We leave immediately," the Emperor commanded. "I'll deal with Valen myself." Cashin looked uneasy, but the Emperor's gaze left no room for argument. There could be no mercy now. The rebellion had begun as a fight for freedom, but it had become something far darker, a battle for the very soul of the Empire. As they moved quickly to prepare for the mission, the Emperor's mind churned. Could Valen truly have turned? Or was someone manipulating him, playing on his fears, his doubts? No matter the answer, the Emperor knew that in order to preserve his rule, there could be no tolerance for betrayal. This wasn't just about loyalty. It was about survival. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden chime of an incoming transmission. The message was from his most trusted intelligence officer, Lieutenant Kira. Her voice, usually calm and measured, now carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. "Your Excellency, it's worse than we thought. The entire fleet under Valen's command has vanished. The Admiral and his forces have gone rogue, and they're heading straight for the heart of the Empire." The Emperor stood still, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Valen's betrayal wasn't just an isolated act. It was the beginning of something much more catastrophic. The rebellion was growing, yes, but now, with his most trusted general leading a fleet of renegades, the very foundation of his empire was beginning to crumble. No more hesitation. The Emperor muttered under his breath, "We strike now, for the survival of the Empire." As Cashin and the other officers readied themselves for battle, the Emperor steeled himself for what was to come. The first true betrayal of his reign had just been revealed. It would not be the last. And the price of his empire's survival was about to rise beyond what he could have ever imagined. The Emperor's victory over Admiral Valen had been swift but hollow. The traitor was dead, his forces scattered, but the damage had been done. The fleet was in disarray, and trust within the Emperor's ranks was shattered. Those loyal to him remained, but cracks had formed, and the air was thick with suspicion. To the outside world, the Emperor was a symbol of power and stability, but within his empire, a different reality was taking shape. It was then, amidst the carnage of a fractured fleet, that the Emperor made the difficult decision. He had to disappear. Not because he was defeated, but because the Empire needed to be purged from within. His enemies were not just on the front lines. They were at the heart of his government, in the very institutions that he had built. If he stayed, the Empire would crumble from the inside out, consumed by the very betrayal he was fighting to overcome. With his most trusted advisors scattered and the traitors entrenched, the Emperor retreated to the fringes of the galaxy. A forgotten outpost on the edge of known space, a world with no name, would be his refuge. The planet was desolate, hostile, and uncharted. It was the perfect place to rebuild, to find the strength he had lost in the chaos of his betrayal. He landed in secret, his only companions the remnants of his loyal guard. Their numbers were small, but each soldier was bound by a singular purpose: vengeance. They would fight, train, and wait. For the Emperor knew that the galaxy would soon realize his disappearance was not a surrender, it was a strategy. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The Emperor's time in exile was spent in silence, but not inactivity. The outpost was a harsh environment, ravaged by frequent storms and wild terrain. But it offered the solitude he needed to reflect on the war that had consumed him. He studied military tactics, sharpened his mind, and rekindled the old fire that had made him a ruler. The past was not something he could escape, but he could learn from it. The betrayal of Valen, the whispering traitors in the capital, they had all been symptoms of a larger disease. a system that had grown complacent and fractured. The Emperor's thoughts often turned inward, to the people who had once sworn their loyalty. Cashin, Kira. Would they seek him out? Could he trust them now? His mind churned with the questions, but there were no answers, only the relentless pull of his singular mission, to destroy the rebellion at its core and reclaim what had been lost. And so, in the solitude of exile, the Emperor found something new: clarity. He no longer needed to fight for the survival of an empire that was built on shifting foundations. What he needed was a new vision, a new order, an empire that was not just held together by power, but by the iron will of its people. He would lead from the shadows, strike where his enemies least expected it. They would come to know what it meant to cross him. They would feel the weight of his wrath. His loyalists, those who had stayed by his side, began to sense the change in him. There was something dangerous about the Emperor now, something even darker than before. The exile had tempered him. His humanity had been stripped away, replaced by a cold, calculating force. It was time to return, but not in the way anyone expected. The Emperor gathered his forces, a mix of old warriors and new recruits. These were not soldiers bred for glory or honor. They were survivors, people who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Together, they formed a deadly, silent army, one that would strike in the darkness and leave no trace of their passing. The first target was the rebel supply line, a key artery that fed the insurgents' growing war machine. It had been a simple calculation: cut off their resources, and the rebellion would wither. A small but lethal force infiltrated their ranks, systematically eliminating key figures in the supply chain. The Emperor's tactics were brutal, but effective. No one knew where the attacks came from. No one knew who was behind them. But soon, the whispers began. Rumors spread through the galaxy, stories of a shadow, a figure who operated with precision and wrath. They called him the Ghost. And as the reports of the mysterious attacks piled up, one thing became clear: the Emperor was not dead. He was back. And this time, he would not show mercy. Kira, now entrenched in the heart of the rebellion, received word of the attacks. At first, she dismissed them as minor skirmishes, the work of rogue factions or fringe cells. But the attacks were growing more frequent, more coordinated. And the methods, they were too familiar. The precision, the ruthless efficiency. It was the Emperor's signature. Deep down, Kira knew that this was only the beginning. The Emperor was playing a game, one that she had only begun to understand. The rebellion would not win this war with brute force. It would take a different kind of battle, a battle for the very soul of the galaxy. As the Ghost's influence spread, the Emperor's forces grew bolder, his strikes more decisive. Every action was calculated, designed to push his enemies further into a corner. He would bring the rebellion to its knees, not through conventional warfare, but through fear, through uncertainty. The time of mercy had passed. In exile, the Emperor had learned something that would define the rest of his reign. It was not the empire that needed to be rebuilt. It was his enemies who needed to be broken. And soon, they would understand just how far his vengeance could reach. The galaxy trembled. The Emperor's return, though whispered about in hushed tones, had begun to spread like wildfire. His attacks were relentless, systematic, and above all, mysterious. To the rebels, it seemed as though the shadows themselves had come to life, hunting them down one by one. Entire fleets went dark, communication lines went silent, and rebel leaders were struck down in their most secure hideouts. No one understood who was behind the carnage, but one thing became clear: the Emperor had not fallen. He was back, and his vengeance was a force beyond reckoning. Kira, now a high-ranking officer in the rebellion, stood on the bridge of the rebel flagship, gazing out into the vast expanse of space. Her thoughts were clouded with doubt. The reports of these attacks haunted her. They were surgical strikes, too precise, too deliberate to be the work of anyone but the Emperor. But could he truly have survived, let alone return so methodically. For months, she had fought for the cause, believing that the Emperor's reign was finished. But now, with each new strike, her faith in that belief was beginning to waver. "Lieutenant," a voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Commander Duran, her second in command, stepping onto the bridge with a grave expression. "We've intercepted another message. Another attack. This one on a high-ranking diplomat in the heart of one of our allied systems. The signature is unmistakable. It's him." Kira's face tightened. The Emperor's ruthlessness had always been his defining characteristic, but now his tactics were changing. He wasn't just targeting military commanders or rebel strongholds. He was going after the people who kept the rebellion's very foundation intact. The political and diplomatic networks that had united the disparate factions. It was a calculated move, designed to rip the rebellion apart from the inside out. If the Emperor could fracture the alliances that held them together, the rebellion would crumble like a house of cards. "We need to know where he's striking next," Kira said, her voice resolute. "If he's targeting our leadership, it means he's learned from his past mistakes. He knows that if he can break our unity, he can break our will to fight." Duran nodded, but there was a concern in his eyes. "We've already lost several systems in the last few weeks. If we don't act soon, we might not be able to stop him. The ghost is too elusive, too powerful." Kira clenched her fists. She knew Duran was right. The rebellion had spread itself too thin, and the Emperor had bided his time long enough. He was no longer just a man to be fought. He had become an idea, an unstoppable force, the very symbol of fear. In the distant corners of the galaxy, far from the rebels' front lines, the Emperor's silence was broken only by the faint hum of the shadows he commanded. His base of operations, once a desolate outpost, had transformed into a fortress, a hive of activity where his loyalists worked feverishly to rebuild what had been lost. But the Emperor was not idle. He was preparing for something far greater than just isolated attacks. He was planning the final move that would crush the rebellion once and for all. In the darkness of his command chamber, the Emperor stood over a massive holographic map, his fingers tracing the lines of movement across the galaxy. His eyes burned with a singular purpose: vengeance. His enemies had underestimated him. They had thought him defeated, forgotten. But they were wrong, and now he would make them pay for every second of that assumption. His agents, cloaked in shadows, moved through the galaxy, gathering information and carrying out his will with deadly precision. Each strike, each assassination, was part of a greater plan, a plan that would not only eliminate his enemies, but reforge the Empire into something stronger, more resilient than ever before. In a quiet corner of the galaxy, a convoy of rebel ships, led by one of their most respected diplomats, Lyricos, moved toward a neutral zone where a critical peace summit was set to take place. It was to be the moment where the rebellion would solidify its alliances, presenting a unified front to the galaxy. But as the ships neared the rendezvous point, something began to feel off. Lyricos, a seasoned diplomat who had once served as the Emperor's personal liaison to the outer systems, had been instrumental in bringing together the various factions of the rebellion. But even she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the Emperor's shadow had returned. She had been too close to the center of the Empire's power, and the silence that had followed the Emperor's fall spoke volumes to her. Now, as she looked out the viewports of her ship, she wondered if the summit would be their salvation or their doom. "Commander, I'm not sure we should proceed," Lyra said, her voice a mixture of caution and dread. "The last few attacks have been too coordinated. The Emperor's forces are moving in a way we can't predict. If we meet with the diplomats at the summit, we'll be walking right into a trap." Her warning was too late. As soon as they entered the neutral zone, the silence of space was shattered by the unmistakable hum of incoming ships. Dozens of them, too many to evade, too precise to ignore. "The Emperor," Lyra whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "It's a trap. The fleet of rebel ships had no time to react before the first wave of enemy forces descended upon them. The Emperor's ships, sleek and black, blending seamlessly with the void, rained down destruction on the helpless diplomats, cutting through their defenses with brutal efficiency. The Ghost had struck again, and this time he had the entire galaxy in his sights. Back in his hidden base, the Emperor smiled. This was it, the endgame. The rebellion was about to fracture. The ghost of the past would rise again to rule the galaxy. The summit had been meant to be a turning point for the rebellion, a moment of hope where disparate factions could unite under one banner and push back against the Emperor's iron grip. But instead, it had become a massacre. Lyricos barely escaped the ambush alive. Her ship, damaged beyond repair, had been one of the few to break through the Emperor's blockade, limping back to rebel-controlled space with the harrowing news. The majority of the diplomats, along with the Alliance itself, had been destroyed in a single brutal strike. No one had expected such a swift and decisive blow. As her shuttle limped toward a safe house, Lyra's mind raced. The damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The summit had been their last hope of securing the unity necessary to face the Emperor. Now, with half their leaders lost and the rest in disarray, the rebellion was on the brink of collapse. She had failed them. They had failed themselves. But as she gazed out at the distant stars, something burned in her chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. The Emperor had struck, but he had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the rebellion's resilience. It wasn't just the Empire's might they were fighting. It was hope, the thing that no emperor could crush, no matter how many fleets he sent. When Lyra arrived at the rendezvous point, she was met by Kira, the highest-ranking officer still loyal to the cause. Kira's eyes were bloodshot, a mixture of grief and determination etched across her face. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply taking in the damage before her. "I don't know how we can survive this," Lyra said, her voice a whisper. "They've destroyed our leadership, our hope. The Emperor's forces are everywhere. How can we fight back against this?" Kira stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "The Emperor thinks he's won, but that's exactly what he wants us to believe." Lyra frowned. "What do you mean?" Kira's lips tightened into a grim smile. "The Ghost's strikes, his precision, they're not just about killing. They're about fear, about breaking us from the inside out. He knows that the only way to stop the rebellion is to fracture it, destroy our unity. He doesn't just want power, he wants our souls. But we're not broken yet. Not entirely." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. "You think we can still unite?" "I know we can," Kira replied firmly. "We have no other choice. We can't let the Emperor win like this." With a steely resolve, Kira began to formulate a plan. While the Emperor's attacks had crippled their leadership, they still had pockets of resistance scattered across the galaxy. The rebel cells were fractured, yes, but they were not without strength. The trick was to rebuild, to reignite the spark of defiance in the hearts of those who still believed in the cause. "We need to strike back," Kira said, determination filling her voice. "We hit his supply lines, his communications. We send a message that we're still here. We can't afford to sit back and wait any longer. It's time to show him that his shadow is not enough to keep us in the dark." The Emperor had made his move, but the rebellion was far from over. The remaining leaders, though scattered, were determined to rally the people against the growing tyranny. Even if the Emperor thought he had won the war, they would prove him wrong. Meanwhile, in the Emperor's hidden fortress, the ghost of his past smiled to himself. He had dealt a devastating blow, but something gnawed at him, a feeling, deep within, that the war was far from finished. The rebellion had been struck down, its leadership in disarray, but there was something in the resistance that he could not ignore, its spirit. The Emperor had crushed their bodies, their minds, but he had failed to crush their will. The Emperor's agents, still carrying out his silent orders, moved through the galaxy, prepared to wipe out the last of the rebellion. But even he could not predict what was coming. Kira and Lyra began contacting key figures across the galaxy. Leaders of rebel cells, old allies, even former enemies. They needed to rebuild the rebellion, united once more. The Ghost's reign of terror had driven them into the darkness, but it was from that very darkness that they would rise again. The first test of their new coalition came sooner than expected. A key stronghold on the Outer Rim, long thought to be a safe haven, had been discovered by the Emperor's forces. The Ghost would strike again, his agents closing in with deadly efficiency. But this time, Kira and Lyra were ready. They would not run. They would not cower. They would fight. The battle for the Outer Rim stronghold was fierce, a bloody clash of will and firepower. The rebels, now united once more under the banner of defiance, held their ground against the Emperor's forces. It wasn't a victory, yet, but it was a stand. It was a message to the galaxy. The Emperor could not kill hope. And though his shadow loomed over them, the flame of rebellion was still burning. As the battle raged, Kira stood on the front lines, the roar of blasters and explosions ringing in her ears. She knew this was only the beginning. The Emperor's shadow was long, but it would not last forever. She would make sure of that. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. The rebellion was fractured, yes, but it was far from dead. And if there was one thing the Emperor had never understood, it was the power of an idea that refused to die. The Emperor thought he had won, but he hadn't accounted for the one thing that could never be crushed: the relentless spirit of the people who refused to kneel. The battle for the Outer Rim stronghold had been a costly one. Though the Emperor's forces were repelled, it was only a temporary victory. The cost of holding the ground was steep. Many lives had been lost, and the rebels had been forced to retreat deeper into the system. Yet despite the casualties, despite the overwhelming odds, something had shifted. For the first time since the Emperor's return, the rebellion felt a spark of hope. They had taken a stand, and in doing so, they had made the Empire realize something it had long forgotten. They could not be broken. Kira stood in the command center, watching the aftermath of the battle unfold. The wounded were tended to, the dead mourned, but the spirit of those who remained was unshaken. The Ghost, the Emperor's mysterious and merciless shadow, was still out there, his forces still lurking, but the tide had shifted. The rebels were no longer hiding in the dark. They were fighting back. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice hoarse from the smoke of the battlefield. She stepped beside Kira, her eyes scanning the damage. "We've shown them we're not finished, but I know this isn't over." "No, it's not," Kira replied, her gaze sharp. "But it's a start. The Emperor will retaliate. And this time, we need to be ready." The rebellion's leaders gathered around the holographic table, their faces grim but resolute. They knew that the battle ahead would be the final one, a decisive moment in the war. If they failed now, they would have no second chance. But if they succeeded, they would break the Emperor's hold over the galaxy for good. "Every day we delay, the Emperor grows stronger," said General Terran, one of the remaining military commanders. "We have no time left. We need to hit him now." At his core, if we strike at the heart of the Empire, we can break him. Kira nodded. She knew this was the only way. They couldn't just keep fighting skirmishes. It was time for the final confrontation. The Emperor had built his empire on fear, on the unwavering obedience of his subjects. If they could destroy that foundation, they could destroy him. "The Emperor's fleet is massive," Lyra said, her brow furrowing. "We don't have the manpower for a head-on confrontation." "No, but we don't need to," Kira replied. "We need to cripple him. If we can sabotage his command structure, cripple his ability to communicate and coordinate his forces, we'll shatter his leadership." A dangerous plan began to take shape, a series of coordinated attacks across the Empire, each one designed to strike at the heart of the Emperor's power. The rebels would target key systems, military bases, and communication hubs, crippling the Empire's ability to respond in kind. It was a gamble, a desperate move, but it was their best shot at survival. "We'll divide our forces," Kira said, her voice steady. "A small group will target his command center. We'll need the best of the best, agents who can infiltrate his stronghold and plant the seeds of destruction. The rest of us will launch a series of distractions, drawing his attention away from our main strike." Lyra nodded. "We'll need to move fast. If the Emperor realizes what we're doing, we'll be caught in his web before we can even make a move." The tension in the room was palpable as the plan solidified. There was no room for error, no second chances. For weeks, the rebellion had been rebuilding, gathering strength, but they knew they couldn't fight the Emperor's full might head-on. They had to outsmart him, outmaneuver him, and strike when he least expected it. As the rebellion's ships prepared for their assault, Kira found herself standing in the quiet of the command center, staring out at the vastness of space. She had been leading this fight for so long, through countless battles, through loss and defeat. But now, as the moment of reckoning approached, she felt a weight settle upon her, an understanding that this would be the endgame. The Emperor had thought his shadow was enough to keep the galaxy in fear. He had thought the rebellion was weak, fractured, defeated. But Kira knew the truth. The Emperor had never understood the true power of the people he sought to dominate. The strength of those who had nothing left to lose, who had been driven to the edge, and yet still fought with a relentless fire. "The Empire will fall," she whispered to herself, her words a promise, a declaration. "We will make sure of it." The rebellion was ready. The fleet was assembled, the plans set into motion. It was time to strike, and the Emperor would never see them coming. In the Emperor's hidden fortress, deep within the heart of his empire, the monitors hummed with data. The galaxy was in chaos, but he remained calm. His grasp on power, though threatened, was still unshakable. His fleets were vast, his forces numerous. He had crushed the rebellion time and again. But as he surveyed the latest intelligence reports, something stirred within him, a twinge of unease. The attacks had been escalating, yes, but there was a new pattern emerging. A sense of purpose. The ghost, his unseen hand, was taking more calculated risks. Strikes were becoming more deliberate, more coordinated. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. It seemed the rebellion was not as fractured as he had thought. They were growing bolder, more organized. It was a dangerous shift. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his throne. The rebellion had not been defeated yet. And this time, he could feel it in his bones. This would be the final confrontation. He would not lose. Not now. Not after everything he had built. But the Emperor had underestimated his enemies once before. And now, they were coming for him. It was time to prepare. The final stand was about to begin. The final strike was imminent. The rebellion had united, their forces converging on the Emperor's core, the heart of his empire. They were ready to face him, to break the chains he had forged around the galaxy. The Emperor, however, was not unaware. His spies have reported the buildup, the quiet rumblings of a last-ditch rebellion. He had anticipated this moment. He had always known that those who resisted would eventually come for him. But this time, the stakes were different. The Emperor sat on his throne, his fingers gently tracing the cold, polished surface before him. His eyes burned with a cold fury. He had spent years building an empire that was beyond reproach. Vast, unyielding. He had crushed planets, exterminated entire civilizations, and obliterated all who defied him. But now, as the rebellion marched towards his stronghold, he could sense something even deeper. The galaxy had begun to change. The fear he had cultivated for so long no longer held sway over the people. They had found their defiance, their courage. "Alert all forces," the Emperor commanded, his voice calm but laced with an edge of steel. "Prepare for the final confrontation. The rebellion will be crushed." His advisors rushed to obey, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in their movements. The Emperor had never shown weakness, but in the last few days, even he had begun to feel the walls closing in. There was no turning back now. He would either break the rebellion once and for all, or he would fall. Across the galaxy, the rebels made their move. Kira, Lyra, and their allies launched a series of calculated strikes against the Empire's most vital systems. As the Emperor's forces scrambled to defend, they found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability and speed of the attacks. The rebellion was no longer the fractured, disorganized group it had once been. It was a storm, focused, relentless, and growing stronger with every passing hour. The heart of the rebellion's plan was simple, yet audacious. Strike at the Emperor's command center, incapacitate his ability to direct his fleets, and shatter his control over the Empire. It was their last chance to tip the scales in their favor. Kira led the charge into the heart of the Emperor's fortress, her mind focused on one goal: to end this war. The corridors of the Emperor's stronghold were silent, the air heavy with the weight of impending doom. The walls seemed to pulse with the echo of the Emperor's power, but it was no longer the same. There was something weak in the air, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "We move fast, and we move together," Kira whispered to her team, her eyes scanning the hallway ahead. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment. They would either succeed, or they would die trying. But it would be worth it. They moved through the maze-like structure, fighting their way past Imperial guards and automated defenses. Each room they passed held more secrets of the Empire's inner workings, blueprints of weapons, lists of prisoners, and orders that would have sent shivers down the spine of any rebel. But they pressed forward, ever onward, until they finally reached the central command room. Inside, the Emperor's personal agents and elite guards waited, prepared for the final showdown. Kira's heart raced, but she was resolute. They had come too far to turn back now. She raised her blaster, signaling her team to breach the door. The battle was brief but intense. The Emperor's agents fought with the desperation of men who knew their lives hung in the balance. But they were outmatched. The rebels had come prepared, equipped with the best weapons, the most cunning tactics, and a resolve that no Imperial soldier could match. In the end, the Emperor's forces fell, their resistance nothing more than the last futile attempt to delay the inevitable. Kira and Lyra stood at the threshold of the Emperor's inner sanctum, the door to his command room slowly opening before them. There, standing at the center of the chamber, was the Emperor himself, his black robes flowing in the dim light, his face an emotionless mask of fury. "You're too late," the Emperor sneered, his voice cold and mocking. "You may have crippled my forces, but it changes nothing. You cannot defeat me. I am the Emperor. I am the Empire." His words echoed through the room, but Kira and Lyra stood unmoving. They knew this was it, the final confrontation. "It's over, Emperor," Kira said, her voice steady. "Your empire is dead. Your reign ends here." The Emperor's eyes burned with fury. "You think you can take it from me? You think you can destroy everything I've built?" "You built it on fear," Lyra responded, her voice laced with contempt. "But fear is not enough to hold a galaxy together. It's hope that unites us, and it's hope that will bring you down." The Emperor laughed, the sound hollow and filled with bitterness. "Hope? You think hope can defeat me? I will destroy you all." But even as the Emperor spoke, a sharp, unrelenting force rose up from the depths of his empire. His agents, the ones he had sent to crush the rebellion, had failed. His fleet, his command center, everything that had once seemed invulnerable, was now crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. The Emperor raised his hand, dark energy crackling around his fingers, but Kira and Lyra were already on the move. The fight was fierce, but this time, it wasn't the Emperor's rage that won the day. It was the unbreakable will of those who had fought to tear his empire down. The Emperor faltered, his power waning as the systems that had once supported him began to collapse. He staggered, realizing too late that the galaxy had already begun to move on without him. In the end, it was not a blaster shot or a blade that felled the Emperor, but the inevitable truth. The empire he had built, the fear he had cultivated, had no foundation. It was a hollow structure, held up by his own arrogance. And with a final, anguished cry, the Emperor fell. The rebellion had won. The galaxy, long silenced by the weight of tyranny, began to breathe again. Kira looked out at the stars, a feeling of peace settling over her. The battle had been long, the losses great, but they had won. And in the ashes of the Emperor's empire, something new was being born, a future, a hope, and a promise that the galaxy would never again kneel in fear. For the first time in years, the rebellion had a chance to build something greater.